Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming to our monthly speaker series today. I'm Larissa Shapiro. I lead diversity and inclusion here at Mozilla. And I'm super, super excited because we have Laszlo Bock here with us today. And you probably know all about him, but I'm going to tell you a tiny bit anyway, and then let him say his own words. Thank you so much for coming. So Laszlo led Google's people operations from 2006 to 2016. And in that role, he was responsible for attracting, developing, retaining, and delighting Googlers. He believes that giving people freedom and supplementing our human instincts with hard science are steps on the path to making work meaningful and people happy, which is something that we also believe and part of why we asked him to come. During Laszlo's tenure at Google, Google was named the best company to work more than 30 times and received over 100 awards as an employer of choice. I think many of us will remember. He's also the author of Work Rules, Insights from Inside Google to Transform How You Live and Lead, which was named one of the top 15 business books of 2015. And I really love that he donates all the proceeds from his book to organizations that support children and veterans. Do I have that right? Yeah. And local organizations like Peninsula Bridge, which works with disadvantaged youth to provide better opportunities. Super awesome. And he's also testified before Congress and written for Wall Street Journal, PBS NewsHour. He's also was an actor in his earlier life. He was on Baywatch. I read all about him. And he used to hold the world record for largest simultaneous Greek Sirtaki dance, along with 1,620 other people. So you can tell us about that if you want. All right, that's enough introduction.
Yeah, that's way too much. That's way too much. Can you hear me on the mic? Is that awesome? Thank you.
Yeah, you sound great.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything before we dive in?
No, thanks for keeping it short. That was
good.
That was good.
I'll keep it short. So I want to dive right into the heart of our shared passion, which I think is people and data and motivating cultural change within companies and cultural values. You started a group at Google called People Analytics. Can you tell us more about it, what led to its formation, et cetera?
Sure. But actually, it reminds me, there is one thing I want to say. It's amazing and an honor to be here at Mozilla.
Yeah.
I can't remember when I started using your browser, but it was in response to all the lousy browsers that were out there. And it was just better and more secure and faster. And it's just so important to give people choice. And it's great to have all of you who work at this organization working hard to, keep the internet accessible and give people a product that's fantastic, that's available, that's focused on their privacy, and just does all the right things. So it is, for me, really, really cool just to be here and to be able to kind of breathe the same air that you're all breathing. And I just want to say thank you for everything you've done to kind of, make the internet great and accessible. And it's really, really important. So I'm really grateful.
Thank you.
So people analytics, the reason I decided to go into human resources, there were a couple pieces of it, but one of them was that when I was in grad school, I'd taken a couple classes on statistics and operations, and I'd always had an interest in kind of biology and science and things like that. And at the same time, I'd always been frustrated by the way leaders behave and what they say, the disconnect between the values they espouse and what they actually live. And I sort of realized as I bumped along in my career that everyone in the people space, we kind of make stuff up all the time. Like we think we're great managers, we think we're great at interviewing, we think we're great at building teams. And we're better at it when we're like 50 or 60 years old than we are when we're 20 years old. And all along the way, people are suffering because they have to work with us while we figure this stuff out. And there's not a lot of science, not a lot of rigor. And before I joined Google, I read an article talking about how IBM had this 40-person analytics group dealing with some kind of issue or problem. And I remember thinking, man, if you could have like 40 people who have advanced degrees, who are smart, who are thoughtful, who could just like focus on proving what works in the people space, that would be amazing, because it's not been done. And so when I got to Google, one of the things I really wanted to do was try to build that out. And so we called it People Analytics. It was the first place to kind of use that phrase, and now it's a whole thing. And we started just by taking 3 analysts. There was a staffing analyst, an operations analyst, and a compensation analyst. And I said, OK, you 3 are now the people analytics team. And it grew from there.
Awesome. Is it on? She's fixing my mic. Okay. So how did the people analytics team set goals and evolve over time?
So there were two elements. Part of it was there's kind of stuff that comes up, right? How do we make staffing work more efficiently? When I joined Google, I think I had about 25 interviews, 20 or 25 interviews. The typical interview time was 6 to 9 months before somebody got an offer. If they got an offer, most people didn't. I remember coming out here doing a housing search, trying to figure out where I was going to rent. And because I don't know if you noticed, it's crazy expensive out here. And everybody had a story, right? Like the realtor's husband had interviewed at Google, terrible experience. The taxi driver I was with, his cousin had interviewed at Google, terrible experience. So it took forever, it was a bad experience. And so one of the real business problems that we started with was, how do you make that better? How do you make it more efficient? How many interviews do you need to have? And what do you need to ask and how do you need to run it? Not just to be more predictive, but also to give people a better experience. So that was part of it. Figuring out like what's the biggest pain point and trying to fix it. And then the second part was just having interesting conversations with people on the team. I funded people analytics by not putting headcount into other departments. So for example, we didn't build like a leadership development function for a long time, and I used those heads instead to build people analytics. And it was so that I could just sit down with the folks and we could just have interesting conversations. And they knew way more than me about lots and lots of things, and the Googlers, the employees, would come up with great things. But it was always important to save that capacity so that we could just kind of blue sky and make stuff up and explore different directions.
Could you tell us about an example of an experiment that team did or some of the obstacles faced in trying to approach experimental HR that way?
Yeah, the biggest one was something called Project Oxygen. And have lots of people heard about that? Yeah. If they have, well, okay, just a few, great. If there's lots of people, I'd give you another example, but okay, that's what's important. So Project Oxygen was basically, the engineering culture was such that the view was managers are worthless. Managers just get in your way, they slow you down, they never understand the job you're doing, so you should have as few managers as possible. And so the team said, okay, we should tackle this question. We should definitively prove that managers are worthless and that they destroy value in organizations or net destroy value. And the thinking was, if we can prove that, we can actually get rid of way more managers and we can run the company differently. What they found was actually managers are really important. And they sort of segmented the company into teams that were high performing and low performing. They correlated that with manager performance. And so you sort of had this nice, beautiful distribution of teams and people who performed really well, who worked for people that we identified as good managers, and people who were poorly performing teams working for people we identified as bad managers. But from a scientific perspective, you can't actually stop there, as you know, because you actually need a controlled experiment with randomization of all the variables. And we thought it would be cruel to actually take people from the good managers and, in a blinded way, assign them to terrible managers and see if they got so unhappy they quit. But we were lucky, and this is one of the benefits of scale. One of the knocks is, as you get bigger, it feels like a big company, it's more bureaucratic, you actually can run a lot more experiments. And what we saw was people were just randomly moving across, not randomly, but people moved all around teams on their own. And they had no information about which managers were good or bad. They could ask people, but they tended not to, and that wasn't reliable. So we had a very natural experiment where you had this natural movement of people all over the company, which appeared, as best we could measure, to be pretty random. And what we found was when people left good managers, their performance declined. Not just their happiness, but they actually performed worse. And when people who were bad performers went to good managers, their performance and happiness actually improved. So then we figured out, okay, what are these managers doing? So we did a whole bunch of interviews, coded the interviews, did a bunch of factor analyses. And the big insight was, number one, managers do actually make a meaningful difference. But number two, management is not hard. Management is not like this mysterious science. It's actually kind of boring. There's 8 things that the most effective managers at Google did. And we published that internally as a list. There's 3 things they did that were negative, that they shouldn't do. And the 8 things were things like had regular one-on-one meetings, acted as a coach. And what we then found was that if you you have this debate about, do you want to like change people's behaviors and beliefs, or do you want to just instruct them what to do? You don't actually have to change people's belief systems. You can actually, and this may come up when we talk about diversity, we just gave them a checklist. We said, here's the behaviors. We're going to survey your teams every 6 months. And it's an anonymous survey. If you get more than 3 responses, we're going to show you the results, and we're going to show you where your results are on these 8 factors relative to the whole company. And you'll get an aggregate favorability score of 0 to 100%. And what was interesting was we did that. Average favorability of managers was something like 57%. So we run this thing every 6 months for 2.5 years. At the end of that period, average favorability was on the order of 85%. So what was crazy was, as the people guy, I didn't have to build training. I didn't have to invest resources. It turns out if you let people know how they're doing in an objective, non-threatening way that's not tied to consequence like pay or promotion or what have you, most people actually want to improve. And they will take steps to improve, and they will get better. So it was a really, really cool study rooted in, let's try to figure out something. We're totally wrong about the hypothesis. OK, what do we do with it? And then how do you change behavior on a really large scale? It was fun. It was really good stuff.
It's totally awesome. All right, I think I'm going to move to data and diversity, because I think what you just said is so highly relevant, and I have so many questions about it because it's my passion. But actually, the oxygen study is very, very relevant for us. So our organization has been focusing more intensively on inclusion and diversity for the last 18 months or so, and we did a big analytics phase, qualitative and quantitative, and then we've built out a strategy, and we're continuing to build. As I understand it, under your leadership, Google developed quite a number of resources and programs and did a lot of research around organizational impact of unconscious bias in particular. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us how that started and what you learned? Yeah,
I read an article in New York Times, New York Magazine, something like that, or New Yorker Magazine, about an academic study. And the study was roughly as follows. The experimental condition is you have people come in, and the person running the study has them read a bunch of stuff and tell them there's a task we need you to do. You're going to go into this next room. There's other people doing the task, and go do this thing. But the people who were the experimental subjects were prompted in one of 2 ways. One of the ways they were prompted was to just have a control. It's like, here's a task, go do this task. The other was embedded within that was some explanation, some contextual clues that talked about how when human beings are confronted with people who are different than them, and that difference can take lots of forms, they're a little uncomfortable. Feels a little weird. And what was interesting was they send in the 2 sets of people, and in the room there's a workspace, and there's a black man sitting at a computer terminal doing some work. And there's a chair next to the black man, and the chair is a little kind of too close for comfort. Like, it's pretty close to where he's sitting. And so one of 2 things would happen. One set of experimental subjects would kind of go in, and they'd step forward, and they'd see the chair, they'd pick it up, they'd move it a few inches over, sit down, and get to work. The other set of people would come in, pause, look at the dude, sit down in the chair, and start working. And the finding in the study was that if you cue people to be aware of differences, their behavior changes in very small, subtle ways. They sort of are more accepting of those differences. And not to read too much into the study, but I took that back to actually the people analytics team and the diversity team. And I said, if this is legit, if this is quality science, what it suggests is one of the ways to address this question of inclusion, which then has all these mediating things which actually drive higher performance, but there's a couple steps to get there, is not to win the hearts and minds of everyone. It's really hard to change belief systems, right? People are raised with all this stuff. Our brains, can only process a tiny bit of the information we actually take in at any one time. There's all these issues around cognitive load and salience. But if you structure the environment a little bit differently and give a little nudge, maybe you can have a really disproportionate impact on how people interact just by raising awareness. So we started, 4 or 5 years ago. I think we were probably the first tech company, certainly, to look at this question of unconscious bias and inclusion. We weren't the first to be public about it, because I wanted to make sure it was a serious enough thing. I wanted to make sure if we put something out there, the science has got to be proven. Because, like you guys, if you say, Mozilla, we're doing this, people pay attention. If Google says we're doing whatever, people pay attention. So we had to get it right. But the genesis of it was this notion that, is there some small intervention you can make that will cause people to pause and be more aware, that causes a difference in behavior, rather than the sort of more traditional approach, which is we got to get everyone to believe. We got to change people's values. We got everyone to believe that everyone's equal and equally capable and should have the same opportunity. And I think we should do that too. But that's a lot harder. And my compromise was, I'll just settle for having everyone behave as if they believed all those things.
So what kinds of small changes did you try? I'm super curious.
Yeah, so we eventually built a course, and there's a public version available if you open up your Firefox browser and use your search engine of choice.
I will.
You will, and look for Google and unconscious bias. So the search terms are Google and unconscious bias. There's a couple videos. They're really rough, but it actually has an early version of our training, and it's an hour-long program. And a guy named Brian Welly is running it.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a website that we had put out called Rework, which is where we try to open source, or I guess they try to open source all the people stuff we're doing, and there's resources there. But one of the things was quite simply an hour-long training course. And most training courses aren't effective. The outcomes and measurements of what happens over time aren't done well. But this started from the way we got there and developed something that actually was proven to be effective was we started not from, let me tell you about diversity, or let me tell you why inclusion is important. Because when you start from that point, you trigger something called identity threat. Nobody thinks of themselves as a racist. Nobody thinks of themselves as sexist or homophobic or what have you. But everybody has bias. Every human being has bias. That's just how we relate to the world, right? We want to hang out with people who wear the same sports jerseys we wear, if you are into sports. And so the way you circumvent the identity threat is you start with less threatening things like there's an online thing called the Implicit association test, which is just word association. And it shows that there's a little bias in how I think about words. And some words I associate more with men and more with women. Even less threatening is to start with optical illusions. Because we all believe we're rational actors and we understand the world and we're navigating it thoughtfully and well. And our cognitive dissonance forces us to do that in retrospect. We sort of go through life and looking back, it all makes sense. And this is why we made these decisions. But if you look at optical illusions, like there's the classic one where is it 3 prongs or 2 prongs on the thing? That's your brain telling you actually can't interpret reality. Like it's actually neither of those things, right? It's a line drawing and it's neither 3 nor 2, but your brain will flip between one or the other. From that kind of entry point, you can get even hostile audiences, people who are hostile to the idea to kind of go like, okay, you're right, I don't get that. And then from that, you can kind of step up to things and eventually have a conversation about, okay, if somebody is, transgendered, what is, why are they just a human being just like me, and why should they be treated just the same way as I be treated?
Yeah, I very much agree with you about how to approach bias, and also that I call them structural interventions, right? It's really hard to change how people feel because people feel how we feel, but sometimes we can change what people do, and that will change the impact.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. Atul Gawande wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto. Fantastic book, and his argument, he starts with by talking, it's about medicine mainly, but he talks about how flying a plane used to be an art, a craft, right? You had these heroic pilots with their bomber jackets and the scarf tossed back behind their shoulder, and 100 years ago, roughly, when they started sort of putting some I guess less than 100 years ago, when they started putting some structure to this, the pilots really resisted. They were like, you can't give me rules. I'm an artist, I'm an aviator, I'm brave, I'm a hero. Like, you can't tell me how to fly my plane and it'll take all the magic and splendor and good people won't want to do it. But they said, well, you know what, just do the following. Like, before you land, make sure the landing gear is down and run through this list. And as a result, planes don't crash, right? So this kind of checklist can massively change human performance with it and behavior without having to change the belief system. It's really powerful. I agree 100% with you.
And I want to believe, because we definitely share this philosophy, that those kinds of interventions and checklists, so to speak, can lead toward belief structure changes as well.
Hope so.
Yeah, well, it's the
Yeah.
goal.
You can't tell people that's the goal.
No, well,
Like you can't.
no, that's not the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know. I have a different question about diversity and inclusion. When you started your diversity and inclusion work at Google, did you need to create a business case for investing in it? And what did you do around that to get that case?
No.
No?
No, for two reasons. One was it was something the founders always cared about. Even predating me, in the very earliest days, Sergey, for example, always cared about, for example, making sure there were more women in the company than you would normally get. So the first intern class Google ever had in 99 or 2000 was 4 people. And Sergey, I'm told, insisted that there be 2 women and 2 men. And one of those women and one of those men, one is Jen Fitzpatrick, who now reports to Sundar and runs all the geo stuff. And the other is Ben Smith, who also reports to Sundar and runs a bunch of like identity stuff. But it was always important. And then we had an eng leader, Alan Eustace, who cared deeply about LGBT issues. We were late to the party in a lot of other areas, issues around the Black community, issues around the Hispanic community. And I should say not we. I should say I, because I shouldn't be speaking for them. But when it was time to really build out that infrastructure, there were 2 great things. One was, at the most senior levels, the company cared about it. And the second was, you know, one of the funny things is when you're an executive or a manager and you have teams of people under you, you can kind of do whatever you want with the headcount. So I always ran this approach of feast or famine, where for some of my teams, teams would get headcount every other year. So just like I funded out analytics by not investing in development, you know, I funded diversity by having fewer HR people that following year, and it allowed me to actually add a lot of bodies. And that way, there were also, of course, you ask for resources and so on. But I didn't have to. I had the luxury of not having to fight in the way people sometimes do in other organizations.
That's really compelling, and I didn't know that about the first intern class. And Jen, That's really cool. Another big topic that comes up in diversity and inclusion is, of course, recruiting and hiring. And sometimes I feel like it's all we talk about, although I personally believe that culture and retention are at least as important. But this is a hiring question. You see a lot of programs, discussion around diversity and representation of specific groups within the recruiting process and the hiring process. What about inclusion and thinking about how we include more types of diversity dimensions, points of view, perspectives in hiring? How do you do that?
It's a great question. I think there's a few things. One of the things I'd seen in my last job was that for people from a lot of different backgrounds, the tech industry is not a real welcoming place. And preaching to the choir, but it's not the place people think of or they want to be, right? So if you're Black, that's obviously the case. In many companies, it's also the case if you're politically conservative, especially these days, right? And there's sort of, on the spectrum of conservatism, there's a wide range. But if you believe that what you really want is people to bring their whole selves to work, you want the best people to bring their values and beliefs, and you want to sort of hammer that out and get to truth, you actually need some dissenting perspective and opinion. So on the recruiting side, I think there's a couple things. One is it's important to try to have your interview panels look like, feel like the people you're trying to recruit. That places sort of an undue tax and burden on certain segments. So women in engineering, if you're trying to build an organization with lots of women and you want to improve representation, you actually have to have women show up. Totally unfair to the women because that asks them to do extra stuff and they're not compensated for it. They don't get a performance bump typically. So they should get some kind of recognition or reward for that, or it should be valued by the organization. The second thing is, I think, and it does get to your point about culture, you got to mean this stuff. You got to believe it. It can't just be tokenism. It can't just be, we want more of one or other kind of person. one of the things I learned over the last decade was that, and again, I'm late to the party, but the sum of the minority is the majority. We did this piece of work where we looked at, we had this program called GDNA, Google DNA. So it's a longitudinal study. It's 4 or 5 years in. My goal was to have it run for 100 years, but every 6, and hopefully we'll get there. It's modeled on the Framingham Heart Study. Every 6 months, it's this incredibly detailed survey of people who have opted in, who have been randomly selected, and then they opt in, and then we make sure the sample's still representative. And there's former Google employees in this data set as well. And one of the things we found in one of the survey cycles was that everybody feels like they're part, everybody at that company and the alumni that are in the population feel both like they're part of a community and like they're completely alone and isolated. So, take your stereotypical, MIT educated, upper middle class, Caucasian, male, straight, pick all your majority groups. That person too has the experience of feeling alone and on the outside. And in that experience that we all share, I mean, if you think about it, I got picked on in school, right? I've had a lot of great things in my life, but I had a bunch of really bad things, right? And, I'm a refugee and an immigrant, and, there's all this religious noise in my background and all these things. Everybody has that kind of touchstone in their lives. And so when you come back to inclusion, it's not just having people show up in the interview process, but when they interact with your company, they need to see that you actually seek out what is it that makes everyone feel a little bit like they're unique and special and alone. And that's the basis for actually finding commonality across every background, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm actually flipping around because you just said something that sparked a different question that I had in a different place. We are now, as of the last couple of years, enthusiasts of surveying engagement and employee sentiment. And within the diversity and inclusion program, we also last year did a lot of research which generated a lot of, it has quantitative data, but to date that was representation data. And then we have all this qualitative data about what I would call experiences of inclusive or non-inclusive culture, which we would like to quantify. Mm-hmm. And so we are going to do a survey experiment to do that. And I wondered what your experience is with quantifying qualitative human experience.
Yeah, it can be done. You should do it. Yes, I'm in favor of it.
Thank you, if we're going to.
No, you're measuring perception, but perception matters, right? And then the things to correlate it with are things like performance, progression in your career, retention. And I imagine you'll see differences, most companies do, between your different sort of groups in the company. It's important then, I think, to be open and honest about those differences. And again, that places people who are less happy in a difficult situation, because you don't want every sort of meeting to be like, I'm the one female engineer or I'm the one Hispanic engineer in a group of white men. Everyone's looking at me, and now they know on average, so you want to be thoughtful about if and how you have those conversations. But my belief is, if you have the kind of culture I think you do, based on the work product you have and the reason many of you seem to be here, I think it's fertile ground to have these conversations. And it's important to track it over time. And the numbers are going to suck. They're going to be bad. And improvement's going to be slow and take a while, but it's important. And it's going to get better, then it's going to get worse. One of the things that happens, sorry to ramble, but one of the things that happens is when you start talking about these issues, you see a spike in people saying, actually, it is bad. And you see more complaints. As companies have talked more about women's experience in the workforce, you see women raising the issue of harassment a lot more. And some of that is just more awareness. Some of it is more safety. It does not necessarily mean all of a sudden harassment is spiked. But when you look at it, and when executives look at it, they kind of go like, oh, this is really bad. This is part of the challenge universities have, right? Why universities are so careful and delicate in how they talk about like rape on campus and harassment on campus and things like that. The courageous thing is to look at the data, share it, but let people know there's all these dynamics without making excuses for it, right? Because what you're getting reported is real. And people's sensitivities to things change too. They report something that they may not have reported. Over time, it sort of evens out in terms of people getting calibrated about like what's a real issue, what's intended, what's not. But it's all worthy of debate and discussion and transparency, because over time, you get to a place where as an institution, you're able to actually talk about all these issues and work through them and have people actually be treated better.
Thank you. That's very much how I see it, and we're hoping to use this kind of information to better target the programs that we're rolling out and experiments, basically.
Well, actually, on that note,
yeah.
It's great that you're going to have programs associated with them too, because we did this work on, and this is public as well, on team effectiveness. And one of the 5 things, the underpinning thing that makes teams effective is psychological safety.
Yeah.
And then what we immediately did was we went and sort of told teams, we did this diagnostic, your team is not safe. And the teams like had total meltdowns, right? They're like, oh, we kind of knew it, but now we all, like, this is really awkward, like, I don't know what to do. And then the manager's like, you need to feel safe. So when you're dealing with these kinds of issues, as you're doing, it's really, and as you plan to do, it's really important to have sort of an intervention and support structure set up to deal with this. But just know it's going to be like hard. And last thing, and I'll stop talking, but for those who are not in the minority, however you slice it, in my view, it's your obligation to step up and moderate your behavior and lead and call people on these kinds of issues. There's a lot that's been written about, pick whatever your group is, but here's how to succeed in business and society and what have you. And my very, very strong belief, and what I've seen is, it's the people like me, or who superficially are like me, who actually have the responsibility for taking action and caring, making places safe. So, trivial example, but I know this happens everywhere. Maybe not trivial. It's not unheard of. I'm not saying it's common, but it's not unheard of if you're a black woman working in like a corporate American kind of environment to have a white person touch your hair at some point in your professional trajectory. And I don't know if it's ever happened here, I don't know, but I've had lots of stories where, somebody would just reach out and touch the braids, and you don't actually touch other human beings like that. Like, I wouldn't reach out and touch your hair, but people do that. And my view is, when that kind of thing happens, it's obviously like an awkward, super crazy dynamic between those people, and you walk away from it. I'm told, the women I've talked to have shared this with me, have said they walk away from it, they're like, what should I have done, or what's the right response? The correct response is for the person who looks like me, observing this happening, going like, oh, what are you doing? That's not cool. Like, knock it off. Like, that's weird. And there's lots of ways to engage, but taking the onus off the people in that interaction and using the privilege that you have and the status that you have and the fact that you're not the person in the middle of it to defuse it and turn it into a healthy conversation.
I did not pay him to say that, but thank you so much, because that is so right on. Okay, last D&I specific question, and about a different dimension than the others that we've talked about. We are a highly international company, organization, project. We have staff in 17 or maybe more than 17 countries if you count contract staff, and then community in many, many more. I know Google has also people in many, many countries. We're doing various things to bring ourselves together across the geographies, and I'm interested in what Google did during your time there in that regard, and what you think works or doesn't work for that kind of diversity.
In terms of community building, or in terms of diversity, or?
In terms of how you build community in an organization that's across so many geographies.
Yep. There's 2 big levers to pull. One is, in my experience, and so it's just one data set, but one is when you open up new locations or when you have small existing locations, send someone from headquarters who's been at headquarters for a really long time, who's known, who's trusted, who's a culture carrier, but also has network back into headquarters, because building intimacy across different regions is predicated on trust and quality of the network among the different people, the information flows. So you want to seed those situations with somebody who is known, trusted, revered, even if that's not ideal for that person to do as an assignment. It's the best thing for the organization, and then you grow the local folks. The second, and this is expensive, is travel. bring people together, whether it's the whole company comes together, and that works until you've got a couple thousand or more people, and then it gets a little tough in terms of intimacy.
Now.
You're good?
We're into that one.
But also get people from headquarters out to all the other offices and have the people in the different offices connecting. In people operations, one of the things I did was, I believe in this so strongly that we had an awards program. So like lots of teams, right? So every year we picked our 10 people who best exemplified the values we cared about in people operations. And the prize was you get to visit any 2 offices in the world. And you got to fly business class, which was big deal, like really, really big deal. And so, of course, people would pick like, well, I'm going to go to like Singapore, then I'm going to go to South Africa, right? Because they want to get the mileage in and see the difference. And I said, the only requirement is in each of your offices, you do talks like this and meet people and have lunches with people and share what you're learning. And when you come back, you document it and share back what you learned. It's really, really important because companies live and die by these human connections. And the only way to have that is you got to go spend time with people.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Okay, I have a few more questions, and then I want to open it up, and we have some questions in the room and from the moderator. Are we good, Diane, to do a few more questions and then switch? Okay, so I want to ask you one here, but I think that you addressed it in part earlier. We're so much smaller than Google. We're like, what, 1/70th approximately? And I'm curious about what ideas you have about how we could run experiments in ways that take our size and agility into account. And at the same time, we can struggle with that. An example would be we have a wonderful relatively new hire program that Diane spearheaded. And when we started, we wanted to run an experiment, but we didn't really feel comfortable holding some of our staff out of that awesome experience, especially being small. So we didn't. We gave all the new hires the awesome experience. And new hires, you got the awesome experience. Is there any here? I don't know.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering how you would recommend running experiments that don't adversely impact in a relatively small employee base.
Well, number one, tell your engineers to catch some slack because the standards on social science and engineering are different in terms of statistical validity and things like that. The R-squareds are totally different. So, as you know, right, given your background doing all this, we had a big back and forth where we were trying to figure out how to improve hiring, and the R-squareds on what predicts who we should hire were like 0.3, 0.4, and in people operations we were like, that's awesome because you never get that in social sciences, and the engineers were like, if it's below 0.99 R-squared, it's really not predictive, and we're not that impressed. So, number one, cut yourself some slack. Number two, my opinion would be, most of what we're doing is not life and death, so hold the population out and really see if there's a difference. Because otherwise you don't really know, right? Now, in a way, you have a control group, which was everybody who went through it before the new latest hires went through it, so you can compare those two populations. There's a time lag effect.
Yeah.
So you can do it that way. But don't worry about getting huge samples. Don't worry about perfect homogeneity between the different populations. But do absolutely try it in a spot first or for a finite duration and see how that works and then compare it. And don't feel guilty about the people who aren't getting the goodness because they also won't get the bad experiments that make them miserable.
Cool. All right, I have one last sort of follow on to that. And so think about your questions, everybody, and everybody out there in Airmo land. My last one is, when you do run a people experiment, how do you ensure that the groups are representative of where you want to go? I'm not sure which.
Well, the first thing is you have to, first of all, it's never perfectly representative, right? Because even if demographically it is, psychographically it won't be. You could inadvertently have a whole bunch of introverts in your sample. So you kind of do the best you can. But what's helpful is, before we published the diversity data that Google put out several years ago, we actually surveyed the whole company to gather that data and asked them to voluntarily share it. So we made sure we actually had robust data, at least on that dimension, which then feeds into the experiments on an anonymized basis. And the reason we had to do that is because The way the federal government, if you do work with the federal government, you're required to submit a form each year that has your diversity data. And the way the government requires you to get it is when people get hired by a company, there's the employment form. It's optional whether or not they indicate their diversity. There's a few finite buckets they can slide into. A lot of people don't fill that out. The government, though, requires you report on everybody. So the best practice on this is HR departments. I'm not speaking specifically about Google, but in general, HR departments will first look at someone's name and go, does that sound like that person's Hispanic? Does it sound like they're from the Middle East? And if that's not helpful enough, they will often look in the employee database and look at their face and go like, are they Indian or are they Hispanic? Kind of, I'm not sure. I'm going to say Indian, so they're Asian. That's the quality of data most companies start with and report from. And it's a leap of faith to get your employees to actually tell you who they actually are, but it does give you more validity. You get into a small N problem, where for a lot of the slices, so I know when we've shared data at Google publicly, one of the criticisms, the valid ones, has been, how come you don't slice the data more ways? And internally, people say the same thing too. While there's enough, for example, black people at Google to be able to slice some of the data, once you start doing job level analysis, what you end up with is like, okay, well, in Mountain View, at this job level, in software engineering, how many do we have? Oh, it's one. You can't do the analysis.
Suddenly it's Elmer or George or Nancy.
Yeah.
Not cool. Yeah, we are familiar with this problem. And I think the other thing about identification is super important. We have approached stuff like our EO1 by just strongly encouraging our staff to report, but not everybody does. You might hear from us again, encouraging you to do it. But it's challenging, and also we're a very privacy-oriented company, so I think sometimes folks just don't want to disclose, and we try not to guess if we don't have to.
With we always tried to tell people what the information is going to be used for, who has access to it, and what the controls are, as you do with your user data, right? So, but it also takes time. The first time we did an all-employee survey, the participation was 50%, and now it's in the 90s, but it takes time, and the biggest thing is, don't betray the trust along the way, which of course you wouldn't. And the second is share the results back so that people can see, okay, something good is coming of this. It's not just, my overlords, monitoring me. But it takes time, as you know.
It does. We just shared back some results from our most recent one in our last company meeting, and I think I hope that people would agree that that's a useful practice. If you don't agree, we want to know. All right, so that's the end of my official questions. Thank you. And Diane, do you want to handle the additional questions and from the room? Yeah. And we have a few queued up for the moderators too.
Oh, okay, great.
You have them, or I have them, whatever.
Yes, so we have a number of questions. We will get to one in the room real quick. I want to take one through the global channel first. So lots of interest in this topic. First two questions come from someone in our hiring, very interested in this subject. So I'm going to combine them. The first one is, what are one or two things that you wish you had done differently regarding your diversity hiring? And then related to that is, did you have a checklist for debiasing hiring?
Great questions. Before I answer, this is like recorded and streamed and all this, right? So non-Mozilla people will see this?
Correct.
Okay, can I see that microphone? Like this is, I did a double take because so for people not in the room, I don't know.
Oh, you
this is their microphone? Like it's the weirdest, I don't want to cause feedback, but this is apparently, this is like.
We throw it.
Do you really?
You'll watch, we will do it in a minute.
Okay, well. Here you
Throw
go.
it back, throw it to Diane.
That's awesome. Okay.
Well, I get scared.
Okay. So the questions were, hiring, did we have a checklist? And what was the first part of the question again? Sorry.
And one or two things that you would have done differently.
Oh, done differently.
Diversity.
Yeah, a lot of things. I would have focused on it way, way, way sooner. I could argue or hide behind the fact that, well, we were growing like crazy. We just wanted to, hire as many people as we could. But I would have focused way, way, way sooner on it. I also, I think, had I been able to, would have invested way more in education and community outreach. There was something that got some press a couple months ago. A number of years ago, the diversity team opened a after-school program in Oakland. And they didn't say it was a Google thing. It wasn't announced at Google as a Google thing. It wasn't filled with Google products. They actually went to Oakland and went to a bunch of schools and said, what would be most helpful? And they said, well, in this neighborhood, kids just need a place after school. Maybe they can get some tutoring. So they just showed up and started doing that. And 3 years later, it somehow leaked that, oh, it was actually Google behind it. But that kind of thing where you show up, you ask the community what they need, you provide it, and you know what, 3 or 5 or 10 years later, it turns into something. I wish we'd done more of that sooner. In terms of the checklist for interviewing, the new hire orientation and new manager orientation and interview training all go through, all have unconscious bias training embedded in it. And I'm not sure actually if it's as formal as a checklist, but there's a lot of things in there about just being aware of these differences, making sure you're creating an accommodating environment. There's obviously lots of dumb things you should not ask. But if you're interested, actually, if the Mozilla folks are interested, I can connect you with the person who's still at Google who can share whatever's in there.
Yes, please. You could connect with me and I would pass it on.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
I think we had one in the room.
go for it. We're not really
So if I
sporty.
may be selfish and ask 2 questions. First being kind of the more appropriate question, is there a program or maybe a perk program that you were interested in kind of launching at Google but just didn't make sense for an organization of your size and scale?
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of programs like that. And I don't know if the size was the constraint or not. So for example, there was an article, I think New York Times Magazine this time, that talked about a healthcare chain, a hospital chain in Texas. And what they were experimenting with was they were just sending nurses out to check on people. So if you're diabetic, a nurse will come to your house 2 or 3 times a week just to check in on you, see how you're doing, are you taking your medication, are you getting up, are you moving around? And what they found was it massively reduced costs because people comply better with treatment regimens and so on. And people also open up and share a lot more of what they do. So at one point I suggested, why don't we just hire 30 nurses or contract with a hospital and just have them start going to every employee's house all the time. That didn't get off the ground. But I think it would have been really powerful. We briefly had a sabbatical program, which I think lasted 2 years, and then that was canceled. So there's a whole bunch of things, but there's not one big shining. The beautiful thing was we were able to do a whole bunch of crazy stuff, and I'm sure they'll continue to do so. So not a lot of regrets on that side.
And one more question. Early on, you mentioned being a fan of kind of human nature and science. Are there particular books that focus on human behavior that you just gravitate towards, or maybe are favorites of yours?
Yeah, there's a couple that are they have very specific things in them that I really like. There's a book written in the 70s called Impro, I-M-P-R-O, about improvisation. Whoa, okay. See, this is a special place. So for those on video, well, I mentioned that book before, and most people are like, what is that? So, awesome. So there's this it's about how to improvise. And there's this awesome chapter about masks. And it was a real epiphany for me, because the author, who's an instructor, writes about how he's trying to teach people how to act and how to improvise and how to sort of inhabit different characters. And it's really hard for people. And then the exercise is he gives them masks, and all these weird, grotesque, oversized masks and what have you. And all of a sudden, they completely transform. And not just how they talk, but their movement. They become hunched over. They move faster or slower. They become these personas. And the insight for me, there's lots of cool stuff in the book, but the insight was we're massively constrained by how we think of ourselves and how we identify our identity. When in reality, any of you can be anything, right? I mean, anything at all, any kind of person at all. And in a way, it's a choice. And the mask, because it mediates between my actual face and the world, gives people this freedom. So it kind of sparked this exploration of what else can you do in institutions to free people from that kind of thing. I know Richard Dawkins is, there's some controversy associated with him, but his book, The Selfish Gene, is also really fascinating because it, again, it's biology, it's not people stuff per se, but the dynamic around self-preservation and how organisms and components of organisms perpetuate themselves and act actually has a lot of metaphor in how companies behave. And then the last one is if you don't have a technical background, there's a book called Full House that was written by Stephen Jay Gould, who was an evolutionary biologist at Harvard. And that was sort of my first exposure to statistics because he basically argues, he's incredibly rational and scientific. He opposes creationism, and he sort of says that, his whole book is constructed against the argument that there's infinite complexity. Surely that was designed by a master clockmaker. And he says no, because if you think about statistics, there's a minimum level of complexity, which is a single cell or a component of a cell. There's infinite complexity above that, so given long enough time, you're going to have lots and lots of things happen. And then he goes through the statistics about why all that happens. And inevitably, you're going to have convergent evolution, and you're going to have speciation and all this complexity. So those are the 3 books. Sorry that none of them are like good to great or whatever. I haven't read that. I'm sure it's terrific.
Those are great books.
Okay, we have some more.
Yeah.
All right. This is an interesting question. How do you maintain inclusion or inclusive environment when you have religious or political views that appear to be in conflict with each other?
It's super hard. It gets to the difference between behaviors and how they manifest and what people actually believe. It also gets to the issue of civility. So the journey I experienced at Google was, first we started focusing on diversity. That led very naturally to this notion of inclusion and unconscious bias in particular as a way to unlock that. Because the problem with diversity per se is most people, as I said, don't identify as racist. So they kind of, there's a couple people who are like, yep, totally get it. There's a couple people who, are actually terrible people who are racist and filled with hate and will never get it. And then everybody else is kind of like, oh God, corporate training. Like really, I have to and so unconscious bias is a way to sort of get around that. And then what we saw, and I saw, was that raised these kind of hard issues about you get more reporting, different segments of the population are less happy than others. How do you deal with that? And the key there was we went through kind of this multi-year journey talking about civility. And how do you have conversations about these issues? And it's actually, particularly in engineering organizations, it's a non-trivial thing to tackle. Because if you look at the academic research, there's 5 or 6 archetypes of bad behavior. One of which that you see a lot in these kind of settings is people saying, well, you're talking about inclusion, I'm just being me. I'm bringing my whole self to work. Isn't that what you wanted? And the problem is inclusion isn't like a binary logical set of laws. It's a value system. And there's certain views that, every view, every debate is worth having if the other person is truly interested in the pursuit of knowledge and growing and getting better, and if the terms are civil. But it's really, really hard to get there, particularly in engineering cultures, which prize finding the bugs and what's wrong with your argument, and I'm going to have glory if I find this little tiny thing. So it's difficult. I had one conversation with somebody who was a fundamentalist Christian who said they were really uncomfortable with the company's focus on LGBTQ issues, on the coverage of benefits for people who were domestic partners. And they thought it was just wrong and a sin. And we had a very nice 90-minute discussion about it. And I sort of argued, I ended up kind of saying, number one, I think you're actually on the wrong side of history. So, and number two, in any case, this is the company's perspective. This is what we're going to do. We're going to keep doing it. If it causes you, I'd much rather have you be part of the conversation here. And the person was really thoughtful and lovely and open, but determined and resolute. But if it causes you so much anxiety and pain and tension that you can't be a part of this, that all the good that you do agree we're doing, is offset by the fact that we have, gender-neutral bathrooms, then this may not be the right place for you, and that's okay. But I'd much rather have that voice where we can have a civil conversation. But the ability to have that conversation is everything. And that presupposes that both sides actually want to explore or come to understanding or come to some norm of behavior. And unfortunately, at the extremes, people often don't. And in those cases, someone's not willing to have a conversation. Then you fall back to, well, here are the norms. And one of the cool things about the unconscious bias program was it definitely changed the norms in the company. And if that's not acceptable, there's lots of places you can be that aren't this one.
Wow. We have a
Thank
couple
you,
more
whoever
minutes.
asked that. Go
Yes, Joe Fish. Joe Fish. Yeah, I'm not playing football. I'm too nervous to play football.
Hiya. I have a specific question, and I'm going to try and not make it too based on my own experience. I joined Mozilla a couple of months ago, 3 months ago now, and at the same time I was talking to Google, and I had an offer from Google, and I had an offer from Mozilla. One of the things I noticed about the process at Google, and I had talked to people there before and sort of gone to various stages of interview, and is that it seemed to be optimized for software engineers. And I'm more of a human-computer interaction person. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the processes ended up being aimed at this one thing. And I think there's sort of a larger example there, which is that how do you avoid emphasizing the center of the bell curve, right? And how do you avoid, and not getting the people, or if you want to think of it the other way, how do you make sure that the people who are down the end of your long tail, however you define that long tail, end up having a good experience as well? Because that seems like a fundamental problem, right? You can get the majority of your people, but what do you do about those exceptions? What do you do with people who, whether they are in a different domain, whether it's a different skill level, whatever those sort of extremes are, how do you deal with that problem?
It's a great question. It's so funny, like now not being there, because were I there, I'd apologize. I'd say like, we'll work on it, but it's not my place to. So I'm sort of like living this real time. I guess on the meat of your question, you work as hard as you can to make the process as good and accommodating and warm as you can. So, you may have gotten a survey afterwards that said, like, what do you think of the process? That should be standard and everybody should be getting them. Nothing is 100% compliant and functioning perfectly. There's been a lot of work that Google did when I was there to focus on the candidate experience and make it better. There's some norms which are still just, really off-putting, like people taking notes on their laptops during interviews and not making eye contact and things like that. But one is you ask people and then you take their feedback and you try to improve the process. The data on that is that you'll never get to 100% of people saying that was awesome, because at the end of the day, rejection is, never awesome. But the favorability ratings on, was I treated with respect? Did the process seem like it assessed me in a fair way? All that's trended up dramatically from, my own interview experience. But I think the bigger point is in a large institution, and probably in a small one of the challenges I always felt was, any given year you have 5,000 or 10,000 people joining, right? So, and ideally you want everyone to do everything perfectly, right? You don't want them to focus on pedigree, academic pedigree. You don't want them to focus on test scores. You don't want them to treat a UX person or a human interaction person like a software engineer. So you've got, some large number of people who before they interview should get trained. Often they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the training sticks, sometimes it doesn't. Then you have thousands of new people coming into the system, not only saying, I don't know how to do this yet, but saying, I do know how to do this, because here's the way I've done it at every other company, and trying to retrain them. So there's a kind of treadmill you're on where you're constantly trying to improve the quality of it. There's a couple areas where, even today, we proved years and years and years ago that your academic performance is not predictive of your professional performance once you're more than 2 years out of school. And yet there's parts of the company where they still care a lot about it. Mm-hmm. So I guess the best answer I can give is it's a work in process. I think the experience, I can say with confidence, I'm sure it was better than it would have been 5 years ago. And there's a lot of efforts made to try to make it more accommodating.
I think my experience was that it was better than when I talked to people 5 years ago.
Okay.
I just wanted to come to Mozilla instead of Google. I mean, that was,
Yeah.
when I came down and had the two offers and looked at them, Mozilla was better, but
Yeah. No, it's like anything. When you're dealing with people, you can't engineer it perfectly because there's variation in the individual human behavior. So the big lesson is you can never stop working at this stuff. It can never stop being a priority. Because to your point, most of the people who have a human experience with Google have it through the recruiting side. Right? Advertisers never talk to a human being, or rarely. Partners might meet a few people, but 3 million people apply to the company every year. You want every one of those people to go like, and most won't get hired. You want those people to say, you know what, it was still a good experience.
Yeah. All right. Are we good? So thank you, and thank you to everybody for coming and for your questions. And thank you so much, Laszlo, for coming and sharing your experience.
Thank you.
with
And
us.
thank you again for all you do as Mozilla for the world. It's really, really important work. So I appreciate it. Thanks
you.
for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hang on.
Oh.
Diane, we have a gifty.
You can always remember.
Awesome. I love it.
Swag.
I love it.
because
Ooh, it's heavy.
There's
Thank you.
stuff in there. But this is a good bag, I'm a
I
fan.
can tell. Thank you, Larissa.
Oh,
Thank you very
thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.